Hi, everyone. Today's guest is Dr. Kristin Vogel-Campbell, who began her career as a special education aide at the Chinatown Head Start in New York City and was a classroom teacher for 13 years in California. She has served as a district-level program specialist and director of special education and is currently a coordinator of special education for the San Mateo Foster City School District. Dr. Vogel-Campbell recently earned her doctorate of education from California State University, East Bay. She's the author of Partnering with Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Families in Special Education, which we talk about in this episode. Now let's get to the episode.
I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-creating curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Dr. Kristin Vogel-Campbell, welcome to the Time for Teachership podcast.
Lindsay, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's a huge honor.
I am so excited. You have written an incredible book, done some incredible research, and I'm really excited. I think that'll kind of house our conversation today, but I'm excited to know if there's anything else that you think is important for listeners to know, either about you. I know sometimes the formal bios can feel very formal, and there's we're whole people. So if you want to add anything to that, or just have people kind of keep anything in mind as we jump into our conversation today, feel free to share that.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to always bring up when I'm in conversation about like the work that I do and my experience is that, I've worn a lot of hats that people think of when they imagine a special educator. I've been a teacher's assistant, a student teacher, special ed teacher in a variety of settings, a program specialist, a director of special ed, and a coordinator. But the two hats that I have not worn are a student with an IEP or a parent of a student with an IEP. And I'm very, very clear about my positionality in this regard. So I let the voices of parents speak for themselves. I try not to presume or assume anything about parent experience. And I think that's a really critical piece kind of moving forward into this conversation.
That's such a great point. Thank you for situating that. And I love how much you do that within the book too. It's just a real situatedness of like, I am a researcher and in this work and working closely with a lot of these families. And it really comes through how thoughtful that you are in all of this. And so I appreciate that grounding because I think it is like an intro into just who you are and how you do things, which is phenomenal.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that comes really clear in the book as you kind of read it, but I wanted to ask on the podcast is, I love Dr. Bettina Love's thoughts around freedom dreaming. And so when she talks about dreams grounded in the critique of injustice, I think what a beautiful way to anchor the dreams we hold for education. I'm curious, how would you describe that outside of the book or reading from your book, however you want to do that? But like, what is that dream for you?
Yeah, I was so excited. I'm so excited that you also center this question in the work of Dr. Love. She's been a huge source of knowledge for me. I cannot comprehend doing my job without. So, just really brutally honest, special education is one of the only legally sanctioned forms of segregation outside of our carceral system. And when we think about abolition, like Dr. Love talks about, when we think about intersectionality and justice, disability always needs to be considered and included. Just thinking about that school to prison pipeline, so many of our incarcerated folks, persons of color, are folks either with, a history of disability in school or with undiagnosed disabilities. And kind of the dream that I hold for education, I think about when I was a middle school resource specialist. And I would share with my students that my ultimate goal was for them to exit my classroom. And I would always frame it in saying, I adored them, I enjoyed working with them, but I wanted them to develop the skills and the agency to learn thrive in a general ed setting. But at the same time, I also let them know that this was not something that was their sole responsibility, that the adults in education need to shift their attitudes as well as learning new skills in order to make this happen. So my dream is that, all education is special education. When we think about special education, it's differentiated, and all of our students learn in different ways. So why can't that happen in a setting where everyone is getting that at the same time? That's equity and that's justice for me.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Yes. And I love that you anchor your work in disability studies frameworks, and disability studies and education frameworks. And like, I think that's absolutely it. The ties to the carceral state, that connections you made, the idea of the goal being to exit the classroom. I mean, how many educators, but also like leaders and system-wide leaders really articulate that goal, or even honestly have it in their heads. Like I can say I, as an educator, like hadn't had, when I was in it, I had not had that kind of thought process, right? And we're just kind of like, okay, this is, your students are here and they are here forever, right? And we don't think about that dream, that extension.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, yeah, that's it's a journey that I've been on in my 20-ish years in special education. That's not the mindset that I held at the beginning or even in the middle of my journey. But I think my doctoral program, doing a lot of very like in-depth research into, like you said, disability studies, but also abolition studies, critical race theory, Black feminist thought, abolition looking like our students being able to, you know, thrive in setting that the majority of our other students are in. It just comes down to that. Um, so yeah, that's kind of how I, ground myself in the work that I do.
Beautiful. Oh my gosh, I love it so much. And it really speaks to the idea that like our system is set up to fail students versus that there is
Mm-hmm.
an individual, right, like issue with students. It's just like our system has made it so that differentiation isn't like just like go-to thing for all students, right? Which it should be. And so I think there's a lot of structural things that you point out in the book, which I think are so eye-opening. I mean, even for me as a special educator who was like in it, realizing, for example, that 94% of the procedural safeguards documents from the 2012 research, anyways, were written at a post-secondary reading level. I mean, and you talked about how like the special education teachers sometimes were even like, I don't even know, right? Like what's, and then so I remember being a first year special educator and just being like, whoa, what on earth is this massive document we're sending home? Oh, we have to do it. Well, I guess I'll just send it home, but I don't really know what's going on here.
Right.
That's nuts.
Yeah. It's it doesn't make a lot of sense. And, procedurally, one of the things that, we're obligated to do is to either send that home for parents to review beforehand or to present it to parents at the beginning of the meeting. And it always looks like, here's this 19-page document. Do you have any questions? Okay. That doesn't really set us up for a level playing field. So what we've done in the past is, taking that 19-page document, first off, providing our educators and our site leaders with kind of an in-depth like training on what that document looks like, what those rights look like, what parents and students are entitled to under IDEA, and then creating kind of like a 1 or 2 page bullet point that we can share with families in addition to that 19-page document. It's a little bit easier for them to digest. And then, the challenge is our procedural safeguards. I believe right now we have procedural safeguards translated into 30 something languages in our district and in the state of California. Um, the resources and the time and the skill to translate that. So we're making sure that all of our families, regardless of language differences, have that cheat sheet or cliff notes. I always like to preface it by saying that. But yeah, it's not setting us up for a successful meeting if we're just throwing a really important document at parents and expecting them to participate without having a lot of front loading.
Yeah. And I love that idea of the bullet pointed list. Brilliant. And just thinking about, right, it is very resource intensive, but what are the ways that we can support like
Mm-hmm.
the way that it's set up? Like I know you talked about how like in the book, there's, really special education services in general are like, it's a legal compliance model. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not, let's get creative, let's figure out what's best for students. It is like, we are checking the box, we are doing this thing. And that's kind of what the structure lends itself to. And so that's kind of what happens. And there's all sorts of barriers. I mean, you talk about language translation being actually one of, I think Gonzalez and Gable said it was one of the most significant barriers to family engagement in the IEP process. There's, the idea of gender, which came up, which was really fascinating to me that most of the research in this is actually done with moms, not dads. And there was like a dad in
Mm-hmm.
there who was saying, there's a separation between me and the female teachers who talk to my wife, look at her, and use Mr. when they talk to me. It's like a removal. Like it's not. It was interesting to me reading that. I was like, oh, I always see that as a sign of respect, but also problematic in a gendered way. But it's actually to him like, you don't respect me in the same way, or you don't connect with me, I should say, in the same way. There's like, lost wages that you cited from people taking work off just to be able to make it to the meetings. All of these structural problems, like I'm just thinking about maybe a leader listening who's not intimately involved with the IEP process, who may not be aware of all of these pieces, but like that's just to paint the picture. That's what we're working in. And then given that, I mean, feel free to expound upon any of that, but I'm thinking
Yeah.
given all of those challenges, what is the path forward? What kind of brought you to this research? What advice would you give someone who is listening, thinking like, whoa, well, we don't want to do that in our school or district. So like, where do we go now?
Yeah. So when we think about systems and structures, we always think of that triangle, that pyramid, and information flows from the bottom to the top. And we usually think about it in resources and policy are the first things that need to happen when it's actually the opposite. And one of the visuals that I share with my teams and I use in some of my research is that inverted triangle. Peter Senge and a couple of his colleagues developed it. Um, Transformational change needs to start with mindset. Um, that allows us to shift to the relational change with relationships and connections. Policy, practices, and resources, like AKA money, that comes last. That's where we come into the problem of, well, we're just throwing money at a problem and nothing is really happening. If you're not focused on mindset before you invest money in a problem, you're not really going to see results. Um, so my passion is really getting into the weeds with the mindset and the relationship building and repairing those relationships. And you spoke about it a little bit when you mentioned some of the dialogues that I engaged in with families. Um, but the repairing of the relationships also goes into work with teachers and students. And, you know, I continue my work with dialoguing with families, even outside of the examples in the book. The most recent kind of conversation and vision planning that I had with a parent was a translation issue, where the parent only spoke Spanish. And we brought in a Spanish language interpreter. A physical therapist was reviewing their report and was talking about how the student needs braces or AFOs in order to walk effectively. The interpreter didn't have the language and the knowledge of that very specific vocabulary and interpreted to the parent that the school team was recommending that he go to the doctor and that the doctor should fit the student with prosthetic legs. And we
Oh
had
no.
uh, yeah, like and so this interpreter told the dad, well, we think that his legs should be amputated because they're no good and he needs a prosthetic leg. We needed to pause the meeting because of time, because IEP meetings are stacked one right after the other. We had a second part of this meeting 2 weeks later where we had a different translator come in. And the dad was like, well, wait a minute. Like, I went to the doctor and the doctor had no idea what I was talking about. out. And we found out that this dad had been, you know, kind of stirring over the fact that he thought that the school team was recommending that, his son have his legs amputated. And it was horrible. And, I found this out through talking with the dad, um, and then touched base with the school team to kind of get their thoughts about, well, how did that sit with you when you found out that we had this interpretation different, or just like the worst case scenario? And several of our school team members broke down in tears. And so I think it comes to effective interpretation. First of all, making sure that our interpreters speak the same dialect as our families. I think about all of the different languages in India. So some of our educators might say, well, the family speaks Indian. Okay, Indian's not a language. There are dozens of Indian languages. So making sure it's the right dialect, and then making sure that that interpreter has the specific vocabulary to be able to convey like educational, like scientific based terms. And then having the team stop and give the families an opportunity to ask questions. So yeah, that every time I come up to a situation where I hear something like that, I realize that, the work isn't done, that even if a successful day happens the day before and I'm working on repairing and restoring a relationship with a family, that we have so much more work to do. And the week that dad spent wondering what disconnect was happening, like, why does his son need this medical procedure? Like, we're never going to be able to give that back to him. We're never going to be able to give back the peace and serenity, the reduced stress, that could have been easily preventable.
Wow. That
Yeah.
is bananas. Oh,
Yeah, that's a really great descriptor of it. It's just, we always say special education, there's always something new, but I would never imagine that it would be um, that horrible. And I'm
yeah.
getting goosebumps just thinking about it and talking about it again.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you so much for sharing it. I think it really illuminates. I mean, that's a like you said, worst case scenario version of a lack of the technical term in interpretation. But I do think that there are so many probably smaller versions of or examples like that are maybe not as extreme, but they happen all the time because that is such a, I mean, even just
Yeah.
monolingual, like English to English speakers talking about the technicalities of a diagnosis, an apparatus or something, or a tech support piece to a student with an IEP that it's very specific, like a nuance. We might not even have that language in the same language, right? So I think you're absolutely right. There are nuances to this that we don't always think about. We're just like, oh, there's a translator. We're good.
Yeah. And, even with monolingual English speaking families, you're a former special educator. We have all of our acronyms, and, special educators sitting at a table, we can talk about IEP, SST, AT, AAC. And if we're using those acronyms with parents and families and even general education teachers, their eyes are going to glaze over because they don't know what the heck we're talking about. So we need to break down those terms. One of the things that I intentionally did at the end of my book was a glossary of all of the acronyms. So, the first time that I use an acronym in the book, I, spell out what the acronym is. And, just for the sake of space, acronyms are used throughout the book, but, you can always go back and kind of see what that is. And I think we need to be very, very specific about doing that when we're just talking about accessibility in general.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And and you mentioned a story about this actually in the book, as a family who was like East Coast to West Coast, moving back and forth, or made the move at least once. And the differences between like the structures of the school and the policies of the state, and just even as a special educator myself, talking to people who are in different systems, like there might be a different acronym or a different platform to house the IEP documents or whatever. And it's like, this is so exclusionary to educators, even just within the educational space. It's nuts.
Absolutely. I started, I did my uh, undergraduate and master's degree in New York, which is where I'm from.
Hi, this is Leah from the podcast team. In this episode, Dr. Kristin Vogel-Campbell is sharing her free resource, a PK through 12 school meeting accessibility protocol. You can get it at lindsayBethLyons.com/blog/170. Now back to the episode.
Special education spaces. We talk about special education as a service, not a place, but, in reality, there are designated spaces that, and I'm air quoting, of course, you can't see that, but there are spaces that are designated as special education spaces. On the East Coast, they're kind of called like self-contained classrooms. In California and in some of the West Coasts, they're referred to as SDCs or special day class. So without being really specific and explaining all of these things, parents are not able to effectively participate, which is one of the things that districts and schools are obligated to ensure. And it is more than just checking that box at the end of the IEP meeting. It's, going back like, hey, do you have any questions? Hey, just being very clear at the beginning of the meeting. If something doesn't resonate with you, if anyone on the team is saying something that does not sound like your child, like, feel free to ask or to probe or to question. And when we're talking about families from, other cultures who, position educators, kind of as like the sage and the end all be all, they have part of their culture is to not question educators. And so in working with like culturally and linguistically diverse families, helping them shift their mindset to it's okay and it's acceptable to ask a question or to say, hey, that doesn't really sound like something my kid would say or do. So those are some of the shifts that are really difficult. And I think, I would put more of the onus on teachers and educators to shift their mindset, but in empowering families and making sure that their voice is centered. Sometimes it does require them to go out of their comfort zone and to shift away from some of their cultural beliefs and norms as well.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love it. And I wanted to name that you distinguish too in the book involvement versus engagement of families. And so to be
Mm-hmm.
able to say, involvement, I think you said is really just including them in these procedures we have to kind of go through. But the school owns those procedures. It's not truly like engagement or partnership. Whereas engagement is like the parents are actually leading that conversation. And I love how you already kind of started us down the track of thinking about the specific actions that educators could take or that we could do together with families. And you, what I loved about this is you had all these dialogues with these family members, and many of them
Mm-hmm.
actually suggested like either this is what we do and it has worked for us, so like learn from that, or like educators, if you're listening, here's XYZ ideas that I have as a family member, and like we should try to implement them, which I love that those voices were really central to the possibilities. And I love that language that you use to possibilities versus recommendations, the
Yeah.
possibilities that you painted in the book. Do you mind talking us through some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and possibilities is it's open-minded. I think recommendations, it's very prescriptive and, thinking about looking at more of a social model versus the medical model. Like I'm not prescribing that you do this because your school community looks a lot different than the ones that I work with. So I think some of the mindset shifts that, parents have recommended in the book, presuming competence, just in presuming competence in our students, presuming competence in our families, and frame things through an assets-based mindset. I think our families hear about, especially students in special education, well, they can't do this. They're not able to do this. They struggle with this. Semantics are really powerful, and framing things in they are working on, or they thrive when provided with this support, or even just starting it out with they're able to do this, this, and this, and they are, you know, um, developing their knowledge in being able to do this. Um, that's a really amazing way to capture parents and engage them in the conversations. Being proactive, and just very simple as don't always touch base with parents when something bad happens. When something amazing happens, or if a student has a great day, or they, ace their, speech and language session, send a parent a quick email or a phone call and just let them know that, so that they're getting a balance of communication from school. And also, asking, not assuming. And I think that gets us into um, a lot of trouble sometimes, where we assume, for example, oh well, parents not able to make parent teacher conferences, or they they really have a difficult time coming to the IEPs that we schedule according to our niche schedule. They don't care, or they're not involved. Parents work 2 or 3 jobs. They have non-traditional work hours. Sometimes, expanding the definition of who family is, intergenerational families, having, aunties or uncles or grandparents, older siblings. And, parents can, send those folks in as a proxy if they're not able to participate in meetings. And that kind of leads into just honoring familial knowledge and recognizing the wealth and the skills, especially those like second language skills that, I think in English based schools that we are in America, you know, bilingualism needs to be honored more than it is. Um, and then finally, just, speaking with families, not at families. And then going back to the interpreter piece, one of my major pet peeves is when we have an interpreter in the room during a meeting, and the staff are making eye contact with the interpreter when they're talking. And I think it's a natural instinct because we're speaking to the interpreter so that they're able to interpret to the parent in their home language. But that is really disinviting and disengaging to families. So making eye contact with parents, or like making gestures, and making sure that even if you don't speak the same language, that you are connecting with them in your messaging, so that the interpreter is then able to use your words and pass that along to families. And trust is earned, not given, especially when we are working with families who have been burned in the past, or have encountered harm within education systems. A lot of our families, maybe didn't have the best experience in schools themselves. Some of them may have received special education services, and we've made a lot of progress in special education, but if families were part of special education in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s, we've come a long way, but their perception is that things are just the same as they were back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah, you went through so much there. And I was thinking too about like the trust piece when you had said earned, not given. I was thinking, yeah, like for educators, right, should have to earn the trust. And I'm hoping that like educators can give the trust instead of making families earn their trust. Because I was thinking about that example when a couple was speaking, the parents were speaking in Japanese to each other to translate a word. And the principal actually stopped the meeting and requested a
Yeah.
translator the family didn't even want, right? It's just like this display of, I don't trust you. Like you're speaking language I don't speak. And therefore there's like a breakdown of trust. It was like, what?
Yeah, that was a pretty difficult dialogue to engage with. Also, the father in that dialogue was a school site administrator. and his wife was a paraeducator. So they were part of the school system in the district that their child went to school. And there was still that lack of distrust. And the father went on to say, like, what a waste of resources. Bringing an interpreter in when it's not necessary. Like, interpreters, their services cost money, and that money could have been allocated elsewhere. So that was definitely the school team not being trustful of families, which is really unfortunate.
Absolutely. Yeah. So well said. And I think there's so many things. I just could talk to you all day about this book. A couple of things
Yeah.
that I know that family members in the stories and the dialogue that you shared had just these incredible like things that they were doing that I just wanted to highlight. Like there was a couple, oh, there might have been actually the same couple who were taking the IEPs home. They would add things, request more things. They would add a parent statement, like, this is what we're talking about, or like, this is our stance. And just like that eventually happened so often that the IEP team was just like, okay, right, you do this. And, another family member going in with like kind of a bidding war kind of thing where it's just like, okay, I'm going in at 90 minutes of speech and like, I can go down to 75. Like,
Yeah.
really taking the advocacy stance was just beautiful. Another one I loved was a family member who took a binder out of their bag and placed it on the table with a photo of their child on it, who was like
Yeah.
smiling and like, right, just like, this is a child we're talking about. Like, this is brilliant. And educators could do that. We don't have to wait for family members to do that one, right? Like, we could just do it.
Yeah. And they updated the photo every year.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that little guy is in high school now, and he's thriving, and he had a really successful like upper elementary and middle school team that was supportive of the families, listened to the families, and took families' input in when and kind of developing goals. And they struggled, in the first couple of years. First with kind of like a medical diagnosis, and then having the school team see that the student required some pretty intensive services at first. But once that student, received those services, they had to go out and hire an advocate for them, because that was another one of the families that uh, they were Filipino, and the dad has a very salient quote that I always highlight. He's like, "We trust the system, but we don't understand it. We're immigrants." So they're relying on the system to do what's right. And at some point, like, that trust broke. They realized they needed to get an advocate. Things were set in place. The kid is thriving, and those intensive services were able to, decrease as the kid was making success. So I think it's just, again, reminding parents that they have the agency to push back if something doesn't resonate with them, and you not having to sign the documents at the meeting. I encourage families to go back and to review everything. And I think special education used to be very much, well, we have to get parents to sign right now. We have to get parents to sign right now. That never sat well with me, because they can add a parent statement. They can, look through what teachers have said. They can, ask clarifying questions. And, yes, eventually we want parents to be in agreement so that we can move forward with services, but it doesn't have to be right away. And that's where, school staff really need to be supportive of parents to answer those follow-up questions, and to be respectful of, the time it takes to digest information that, they may not have gone to school about, but at the end of the day, they are their child's number one advocate, and they know their child best.
Absolutely. Oh, so well said. I want to move to start closing because this has been such a good conversation, but I do want to share one
Mhm.
more thing that I absolutely loved. I think this was a family member recommending this, but to do a post IEP survey about the satisfaction and understanding of the IEP meeting. I love that.
Yeah, it's so good. Um, it's not something that we have put into place yet in a formal survey, but even a phone call, an email, asking like, hey, did anything come up that night at dinner or in the shower the next morning. Sometimes my best thoughts come up in the shower. So, just like that's a qualitative survey, but as easy as a Google form or, something through another data collection system so that's valuable data for districts to look at and to see overall parent satisfaction.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. That would be so cool. If you create one, I'd love to share it with folks if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be more than happy to share that with you.
Awesome. Um, Before I ask kind of the typical closing questions, is there anything else that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you wanted to highlight today?
Um, yeah, I think we've kind of gone all over the place, and we could talk for hours about this. But
Yes.
I would just, if folks are um interested in learning more, the book is absolutely available. And I would encourage you to, read that and either get it from your library or if you have the means to do so, like ordering it through like your local independent bookstore. Do some research, talk to families, like ask them like, hey, like what do you vision for your child? Like where do you see your child? What are you hoping to get out of this school year? Just start asking those questions and start the reflection process of, what are some things that I may have made a misstep in the past and how can I rectify that? How can I stop the cycle of harm?
Beautiful. Oh my gosh, you answered the questions that I was going to ask. This is so great. Okay, so this is so good. And then yeah, I love that you named the book. So the book is called, and I will link this and type out the full name and everything in the blog post for this episode, but it's called Partnering with Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Families in Special Education. It is so good, everybody. So listeners just know it is excellent. And I also love, like you said, there's a ton of resources in the back, including an appendix with all of the glossary of terms there that is like so necessary, even if you're in the field of special education. And I would love to know too. So one thing that I just asked for fun is something that you have been learning about lately. Now, this can totally relate to our conversation or not. It can be anything you want to share.
Yeah. Well, two things. So, not related to our conversation, I have been learning how to play pinball more, just better. I am ranked in California and the world, granted not very high, but
Amazing.
that's been one of my passions recently. But connected to this conversation, I just completed like my like year streak on Duolingo to begin to be more comfortable speaking to families in Spanish. By no means am I proficient, but growing with confidence. And I think that is something that really speaks strongly to families is when we make attempts and we learn to speak their same language. I apologized to a parent last week that I was struggling with conjugating like future tense verbs. And in our conversation, he in Spanish said, your Spanish is better than my English, and thank you for connecting with my language. So, I'll call that a win, but, it's still a growing journey. So I would absolutely recommend, learning a second language, be it Spanish, be a language in the community that you work with, so that you can, connect with families and students, even if it's just vocabulary words, or if it's just like, hello, goodbye. It's great to see you. Just teeny tiny things like that. But yeah, I can read early readers in Spanish. So that's what I've been really stoked about.
That is super, super cool. Oh my gosh. And so finally, people I think will want to get in touch with you. They'll want to follow your work, get the book, all the things. Where
Yeah.
can they find you online?
Yeah. And Lindsay, I can also send you the links for this. So my website is still a work in progress, so it's not published yet. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn under my name, and I'm on Instagram, and my Instagram handle is Dr. Vogel-Campbell. So education related, book related, pinball related now, and then just like kind of general life in San Francisco. And I have a YouTube channel under Dr. KVC.
Brilliant. I will link to all of those in the blog post as well. And I think you're also sharing with listeners a meeting accessibility protocol. So it's like a little checklist of like and
Yes.
reflection questions, which I think people will absolutely love. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of things that site leaders can do to make meetings more accessible that don't cost any money. So, if you have money and resources that you can allocate through like your site plans or advocating in the state of California through like your district, like LCAP, your local control accountability plan, you know, there are baby steps that you can take, but absolutely like feel free to use the protocol with your teams and your sites.
Amazing. Dr. Vogel-Campbell, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Lindsay. It was a pleasure.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsayBethLyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.